Hi, I'm Grant.
And I'm Kathy. Welcome back to our Change How You Think weekly video podcast.
If you'd like to hear from us every week, then subscribe to our video by clicking on the weekly video tab at the top of this page. Fill in the subscription form and you'll get our free ebook, Healthy Moods.
Last week, we talked about the story that's continuously going on in your head. The story is your interpretation of everything that's going on around you.
Every moment you're awake, you are evaluating and making sense of what's just happened and making predictions of what's going to happen next.
In the last video, we described how 2 of the 12 spies who went into Canaan told themselves a different story about what they had seen. Their story was based on God's history of faithfulness to Israel up to that point.
Today we want to look at another story from the history of Israel. In Exodus 14, Israel had left Egypt after a miraculous deliverance. God led them to camp by the Red Sea.
But Pharaoh changed his mind and decided to recapture Israel and bring them back into slavery. When Israel saw the Egyptian army approaching, it became clear that they were trapped between an army that would destroy them and the sea.
They began to tell themselves a story about the situation. Based on their past experience and knowledge of history, it was hopeless. There was no way out. They became bitter and blamed Moses.
Moses had a very different story playing in his head. He could see the situation appeared hopeless to natural eyes, but he had been in impossible situations many times before and saw God do unexpected and surprising things that solved the problem.
Moses' story was full of faith and expectation that God had a plan to save them. Then he did something that is a lesson for all of us who will ever face difficult or impossible circumstances.
He went to God and learned the story that God was telling about the situation.
God saw the situation differently. He had a plan to teach Egypt a lesson, so he led Israel to that very spot where they would appear to be trapped. He told Moses the plan and gave him the next chapter in the story.
Moses was to stretch out his hand, raise his staff, and watch what God would do.
Problem solved.
The key was that Moses went to God to find out the story God was saying about what appeared to be an impossible situation. By going to God, it completely changed his perspective and gave him the solution.
The difference between this event and the one with the spies is this. The 2 spies told themselves a story of God's faithfulness and deliverance in the past. That story gave them faith to conquer the promised land, and it was a very wise decision.
In this story, Moses went directly to God to learn his story about the situation and get a solution. He believed God's story and it gave him the faith to act and release a miracle.
Both methods are the right thing to do. Whenever you are facing a confusing, discouraging, or impossible situation, first remember God's faithfulness to you in the past.
Remember all the ways he helped you, loved, and cared for you in previous tough situations. Begin to tell yourself the story that if he helped you then, he'll help you now.
Then turn to God and ask him for his story. What does he want you to know about the situation you're facing? What faith-destroying lies are you believing? What truth and promises does he want you to remember? And then what does he want you to do next?
When you remember his promises and past faithfulness and combine it with his perspective on the situation, your attitude toward your circumstances will completely change. You might even position yourself for a miracle.
But if you are feeling completely stuck and don't know where to turn and don't feel able to hear God's story, then the simplest and most helpful thing to do is worship.
Worship brings the presence of God into your room and your situation, and it also chases out the darkness that wants to keep you focused on the problem.
When you worship, present the problem to God, place it on the altar, and trust him to answer. By worshiping, you position yourself to receive his answer to your request.
The key to discovering God's story is to be able to hear his voice for yourself. So we've created an online program that will teach you how to do that. It's called Free Your Mind.
Through short weekly videos and prayer assignments, you will learn how to recognize the thoughts, words, and pictures that God gives you. You can learn more about it using the links below this video.
And we'll talk to you again next week. But this week, ask God for His story about your situation.